Welcome to my third talk here at Virtual Stampex. A very important part of my job is identifying things about stamps, identifying perforations, the colors, the watermarks, which we'll get to later, but sometimes it's about paper. Paper is very important to stamps. It's the foundation of the very hobby. Without paper, we wouldn't have stamps, and without stamps, we'd be very boring people indeed. So in this talk, we're going to give a brief overview of the history of paper, where it came from, how it was used, and the different types of paper that most collectors will encounter in their times as philatelists. So we shall get going. So of course, paper in itself is a manufactured product, and it merged from 13th century all the way in Asia, and we'll come more to that in a bit. But of course, this is another brief summary of the talk, the brief history of paper, how it was manufactured from a handmade process right through to mechanization of the present day, papers that we use for printing postage stamps, because you can't just use any old paper. It has to be specifically done, treated, or manufactured for the specific use of printing ink upon it. You can't just use any old paper. And then we'll talk about watermarks. Watermarks are very important with paper. Sometimes their role is very mundane, but they can be incredibly important, especially when you get into the realms of watermark varieties. And again, this is another common area philately where I get asked an awful lot about which watermark is this? Is it inverted? Is it reversed? Is it inverted and reversed? And it does take time to work out some watermark varieties. And hopefully in those few slides, it will give you some guidance and help on how to be able to identify them for yourself. So paper, where does it come from? Paper comes from predominantly China in the 2nd century BC. Prior to paper becoming into Europe, people wrote on stone tablets. The ancient Egyptians were known to write on papyrus. Vellum was particularly used predominantly in Europe, and vellum is either sheep or goat skin. Palm leaves are also used, tree bark, and in some cases, human skin. Now, there is a story from ancient Greece where a particular king or lord wanted to send a message to an ally about an impending invasion. So got one of his slaves and tattooed a message on his shaven head, waited for his hair to grow back, and then the slave ran off to find his other master to give the message to him after obviously he had to shave his head to read the message. Now, whilst that's a very barbaric way of sending a message, it does give you an idea that people have always wanted to put down a mark, from cave people right through to the Egyptians, and then to where we're more concerned about the Victorians. People wanted to put things to paper. In the 13th century, with the advent of the Crusades, the knowledge of paper making spread through the Middle East and into medieval Europe. But still, at this time, vellum was the primary surface to write on and persisted for many years. Vellum, of course, being goat skin, it was a very long process to actually prepare vellum to write on. You had to, of course, kill the animal, skin it, take all the fur off or any other kind of things on there, clean it, rinse it out, and then it had to be dried. And also, you couldn't just sort of write on it there and then. You had to prepare the surface with a fine powder of bone meal, which was pasted on to create the surface of the paper. It was also a very unforgiving surface because once you put something down, and you made a mistake, you either had to wait for it to dry and scrape it off and prepare it again. And I've seen that on medieval manuscripts where the monks have got something wrong, had to scratch it out, or they just wrote over the top and carried on. So, of course, if you wanted to write a book, it was a very, very long process to be able to do that. And of course, also vellum collects moisture and it buckles and bends and warps. So you'll often see in very old medieval manuscripts where the book had to be held down together with clamps because all the paper's buckled and things, and it's rather fun when they are like that. There's all these huge monstrous books, but that was one big problem of vellum. By the 16th century, when we're in the period of the Tudor era and in the Renaissance, paper was becoming a much more commonplace material with the advent of the printing press, all thanks to our friend William Caxton. Paper was much easier material to use to bind books and to print on, and the first Bibles in English were printed on handmade papers and were widely circulated. The image that we have here on the slide is the frontispiece to the Great Bible in English. And it was an image I studied a lot at uni. And of course, it has Henry VIII with his great courtiers dispensing the word of God. And it's a wonderful piece of Tudor propaganda. But you could not print that on vellum. Paper was a much better surface in which to print that kind of image on. And at the dawn of the 19th century, paper was still a very much a handmade process. But how do you make paper by hand? What is the process to make paper by hand? Well, paper by hand is a very long process, and it was very much seen as a craft. If one person worked in the paper making industry, you were a craftsman, and there were Freemasonries that were set up for paper makers. It could be quite a prestigious role, and it was often a role for life. And the process in which to make paper really started as a recycling process. Paper was traditionally made by using linen or cotton fibers or other sort of fibrous material, far beyond wood pulp. Most people think of paper as being made out of wood. That didn't really come in until much later. Most papers were made with cotton or made with linen, and they were much more widely available, as wood as a commodity was far more important for furniture, ships, and all the other things you needed to build houses with, because most houses were still timber framed, and even when brick came available, timber frames were still being very much used. And of course, one disadvantage of making paper by hand was each sheet was made individually. It was, and then had to be loft dried in these great halls on racks. And you see this picture on the right here of someone loading on the papers individually to these long wooden poles which had clips on them, and all the papers would then dry, or they'd be winched up on ropes into the very lofts of the roof and dried. So, talking you through now the process on how handmade paper was made. Now, these are images from Turkey Mill in Kent. Now, Turkey Mill was a huge paper making factory from the 18th to the mid 19th century. And it was managed and run by the J. Watman family. Watman is a very famous name in paper. They were the first to create what is known as wove paper, but we'll come to that later. So the process began with the raw material being arrived. So we see on the picture on the top left, big sacks of wool and cotton and linen fibers all being brought, and they would have been torn up and ripped and sewn apart, all the buttons taken out, because as I say, it was a recycling process. If you had an old shirt thrown away to the rag and bone man, the rags would be sold to the paper makers, preferably if they were white, because if they were colored fibers, which there weren't that many, it would disrupt the purity of the color of the paper. So once they've been ripped up into sort of shreds and rags, they were then mulched in this great machine, which you see in the top right. And that would have broken down all the fibers and into very, very, very small pieces. You know, if you drop toilet roll and it just sort of disintegrates immediately, that's the sort of texture you've got there. It is very, very, very loose. And then it was transferred into what is known as a vat. The vat was effectively a very large bath full of water, and inside the water were all the fibers. And when they made the paper, they had what is known as a mold. And the mold, best way to describe it, is a very large photo frame. And across the photo frame was a gauze and wire mesh, sometimes just wire, sometimes a gauze cloth was placed over the top. And then it had a decal on the top. The decal was, in effect, the photo frame itself, the borders of the frame. And that caught any of the fibers. So the vatman, who was probably the man at the top of his craft, he'd been apprenticed for many years, he would dunk the entire mold and the decal, which is the top part of the mold, and into the vat, filled with all the fibers and the water, and then agitate it from side to side, and then pull it out, all by hand. So there was no ropes, no winches, nothing, all by hand, drain the excess water, and then check that the fibers were evenly distributed over the surface of the mold, and then place it to a side where it was then passed to the coutures. Now, the coutures were often apprentices, and they were taught how to handle the paper. And they took the sheets of paper that were draining, and again, still very, very fragile. There's still majority water at this point, and they put them on a big stack, which was inlaid with felts. And then once they'd built up an entire stack, which was usually about 100 sheets, it was put into a press, and then the water was pressed out. And they would keep pressing until all the water had come out, and then Again, the paper would still be a little bit wet. They'd remove them from the felt, put them onto another stack, and then they would be taken off to be dried. And once they were dried, they would then surface the paper if you wanted a very, very smooth surface, or if you wanted a rough surface, they just left it alone. They were used to be put through hot rollers if you wanted a really smooth surface to write on, and that is known as hot pressed. And then the final stage, which was only done by women because women were thought to be the best at checking quality of paper, that each sheet would be inspected and then packed off and sent off to wherever they needed to be distributed to stationers, to printers. Now, the handmade process, of course, took a long time, but up until the early part of the 19th century, every single bit of paper was handmade, from very mundane papers such as newsprint and flyers, all the way to very expensive books and other manuscripts. All paper was made by hand. So this is coming back to the history of paper making by hand. And here you see another on the top left here, another image of the vat and the two vatmen. Of course, if you wanted a big sheet of paper, you needed a big mold. And on the right here is a picture of one of the molds. And this one was used at Turkey Mill. And as you can see, it's quite a big thing. You'd have to be very strong to do that all day. And if the sheet was a much larger sheet, they could be done on sort of a system of pulleys and levers, so that at least the main strain of the weight of the mold filled with the paper fibers could actually be eased slightly to the vatman. But on the whole, each sheet was made individually. Paper making as an industry fell into decline, particularly after the Second World War. There was a severe lack of manpower, and they were unable to compete with the sheer output that machine-made papers could produce. And the last commercial paper mill that made paper purely by hand, which was by J. Green, a very famous name in paper making, his mill in Kent, in Hale Mill, ceased production in 1987, which isn't a million years ago. So you've got to think that even that paper mill survived well beyond many others. In recent years, there has been seen a revival in the handmade paper industry craft, and there's a particular one down in Somerset called Two Rivers Mill that makes some fantastic high quality handmade papers. But these are generally for artwork and old books and manuscripts and restoration of these old manuscripts. It's easier to use paper that's similar to the paper that already exists in these old manuscripts when repairing them, rather than using something that's just come off the main production line. But what are the characteristics of a handmade paper? So an easy one is, of course, the surface. And handmade paper, this is a sheet of handmade paper here, and I'm holding one as we speak, and it's very, very, very rough. It's got quite an irregular texture, and also you have what is known as the deckled edge. The deckled edge is simply the bit on the edge of the mold of the paper. So this is where the paper is strained away from the mold. And on the penny black and the penny red block that we've got here, you can see the full deckled edge. Deckled edges are particularly attractive to some collectors and are certainly worth a premium if they come with a deckled edge, even partially, or a full deckled edge, particularly on the early line engraved. And getting deckled edge on cover is particularly scarce as well. And you can see that the difference is there. So the first stamp, penny black, was printed on handmade paper, but ironically, the Mulreadys and the postal stationery envelopes were not printed on handmade paper. They were printed on paper made by John Dickinson, who was a great inventor. And we'll come to him later as well. So now we know that what handmade paper is this very long process. And by the 19th century, the output of handmade paper could not compete with the sheer demand for paper, particularly once penny postage came to be. Literacy increased, communication increased. You can't just have paper being made on a cottage level and a semi-industrial scale. You needed fast, reliable paper that could be easily produced and be very consistent. One problem of handmade paper was if you didn't buy very good paper, you were stuck with it. It could be thicker on one side and thinner on the other side and very uneven in surface. You can't have that. So by the beginning of the 19th century, you saw the introduction of machine-made paper, which first again happened in France. But as far as the philatelists are concerned, John Dickinson is really the only person we're going to talk about. We're not going to talk about the French in this talk, though we do love the French, but we're not going to talk about them today. And the first type of paper machine that was really invented in England was by John Dickinson. John Dickinson was a great paper maker, and his business, John Dickinson Company, which was manufactured by various mills that he had in Hertfordshire, probably the most famous being Coxley Green, kept on going into the 1970s, making machine-made papers. The name John Dickinson does still survive with the Basildon Bond stationery papers, which were a product that John Dickinson later made. They acquired the name and began making the stationery. Of course, once you have machine-made paper, you've revolutionized the industry. Paper could be now made much cheaper, quicker, with higher consistency and standardization. The machine that he invented is a little bit of a difficult one to describe on how it works, but effectively it tried to bring all those elements that handmade paper had, from shredding the pulp to the vatman to the pressing and the drying, all into one. So this is a description of how the machine worked from the fundamentals of philately, and hopefully this will suffice. As far as we're concerned, because John Dickinson was the person that invented the machine, but he probably stole ideas from the French when we carried on like this. So the vat of paper was at the very, very far end of the machine, and it was full of the pulp, and a perforated metal cylinder, partly submerged in the vat, rotated and revolved and collected the fibers through the force of gravity onto the perforated wires of the paper. So again, they were perforated, water could drain, and as the cylinder moved across, it formed a mat of paper. And again, you could adjust the thickness and the thinness depending on how much paper was allowed to drop onto this rotating mat. And the perforations allowed, of course, as we said, for the excess water to escape and then be recycled. And then the paper would carry on its merry way, and the mat of fibers in a continuous strip was then carried along and subsequently pressed, dried, sized, and finished. This paper can either be then collected into a giant roll, as you can see here in the picture, or cut into particular sheet sizes as it went along. With watermarks, if they wanted a watermark on a machine-made paper, you couldn't do it as the way you did in the handmade process, but it was impressed upon using a dandy roll. Again, we're going to explain about all that a bit later on. John Dickinson didn't just make paper which people wrote on or read newspapers off. He also created security papers. Security papers, as the Victorians were very conscious about faking and fakery in general, he invented what is known as silk thread paper, where lines of silk were inlaid into the paper at the point of manufacture and used on the penny pink postal stationery. They were used on the embossed, but they were also used on the embossed issues, the embossed high values of 1847 to 54. And this is a shilling green, which I handled recently. And you can quite clearly see at the foot of the design where the two lines that run through the stamps, they're not creases, but they are silk threads. And sometimes the silk threads do cause splitting in the paper as well, and it can disrupt the embossing. But on the whole, this particular example remains rather intact, and so of course that's where you get silk thread paper from. Another machine that was contemporary to John Dickinson, it's a great machine, was, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, the Ford Rinner machine, which was similar in design to the Dickinson machine, but the main differences was that rather than a perforated rotating cylinder, it was a rotating cylinder with wire or rubber cloths on top, which carried on the paper, and it was held together with tension from these rubber or the fibrous mats, rather than just by sheer force of keeping it within the mold. And examples of this machine are still existing today, and modern interpretations are still making paper today. By the time of, say, the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, this machine was the one that Harrison's was using to produce the postage stamps at the time. And even today, this is what is making paper for the vast majority of all everyday uses. Of course, the great advantage of machine-made paper is that you've got greater consistency. It's far quicker and the output is absolutely second to none on the handmade paper process. You'd need to employ hundreds more people to create the output that this machine could do in a day. And so, of course, paper prices came down, and even today, paper is a very cheap product. But the one disadvantage of machine-made paper was that the quality overall, many said who were great craftspeople who made handmade paper said that was actually very low. Um, People who made paper by hand almost described it as a very sort of soulistic profession. This idea, this relationship of the cotton with the water, because it had to be good water. You had to make paper in areas with good water. Kent had very good water. Essex has good water, and Somerset has good water. And then it was a purely natural bond, and each sheet was individual. There's something very artistic, very emotional about it. A machine by a handmade piece of paper, whereas machine-made paper, there's no soul. And a paper maker described that to me. He said that machine-made paper has no soul. As far as we're concerned, however, in the philatelic context, paper is a vital element of stamps, and knowing which papers they are printed on and being able to distinguish them is very important. As paper making industry went on, and of course, with stamps, you needed to be very certain and sure about the prospect of faking. If you had a very, very high quality paper, you could spot fakes that were printed on very low quality paper. So that was one example. So some of the very earliest penny black forgeries are done on very toned paper. With paper, you'll often see particular types of papers that are described. Probably the most common one is chalk surface paper. Now, chalk surface paper is exactly what it says on the tin. It is a highly surfaced paper coated in chalk dust. This was introduced by Delarue in the latter part of the 19th century into the early 20th century and was used on many British and colonial issues. The paper was designed to prevent reusage of stamps by removal of postmarks, and any attempt to do so would cause damage to the surface of the stamp. And detection of chalk surface paper is a little challenge. Finger feel is probably the most advisable one. Traditionally, it was done using silver point, and you would touch the silver onto the surface of the paper, and if it left a small black mark, it was chalk surface paper. It's not advisable to do that nowadays because, of course, it does leave the black mark. Though, if you had a very, very soft rubber, you could remove it, but it would cause more damage than good. Most people, again, just do it with the finger feel. Another way is to hold it obliquely to a light where you will see a sort of pitting on the surface. And again, that is an indication that it is chalk surface paper. Now, chalk surface paper persisted on stamps into the 1970s, when it was felt that afterwards you didn't necessarily need that kind of paper as a security method when phosphor and graphite lines and things were introduced. Laid paper is the original paper. Laid paper is how paper was made originally. So, of course, with laid paper, it was, as a consequence of the handmade process, you had the decal and the mold, and the mold would have just had long wire strips running across the entirety, and that stopped the paper pulp from draining away. And when you held it up to the light, once it dried, you saw lots of lines, all these vertical linear lines across the sheet of the paper. That is what's known as laid paper. Laid paper has a much more of a texture than wove paper, which wove paper is a complete matte finish. There is no hint of the lines running through the paper, and it was because a gauze mesh or sometimes cheesecloth was pasted over the mold, and it's the most widely used paper today. Bâtonnet paper is a very thin laid paper and was used on British stamps, but is often encountered by philatelists for use on Indian states. It's a very, very thin paper, can be quite brittle. Then you have granite paper. Granite paper is wove paper, which has had coloured fibres placed within it, as again another security measure. And these coloured fibres are very characteristic of this particular paper. It's one of the easiest ones to spot. And it was used a lot on Swiss issues, and also, if anyone knows the Indian stamps, it was used by Courvoisier in Geneva to print the stamps of the 1948 Gandhi memorial issue. And other papers that are used, which are described in the Stanley Gibbons catalogues, are of generally of varying thicknesses and are quite easily distinguishable. You also get coloured papers, and that is where a pigment was placed into the paper at the point of manufacture. So, of course, you get blued papers, orange papers, yellow papers, particularly when you get to the Jubilees. And they were, of course, with the advent of pigment technology, you could have much more consistent and standardized colors for all these very different types of paper. Now we get to the real nitty-gritty of this talk. Watermarks. And what on earth is a watermark? Well, a watermark in its simplest form is a piece of wire which is sewn onto the surface of the mold or onto a dandy roll like this. This is a dandy roll, and this is from the Stanley Gibbons archive, and I borrowed it for this talk, and it's of the 1950s St. Edward's multiple crown watermark, which is used on the Wildings and the later commemoratives as well. And they are pieces of wire sewn on to the wire mesh, and for a dandy roll, these would be impressed upon the paper as it's wet and would become transparent when it dries. On handmade paper, it's on the surface of the mold, and so that when the paper is made, it displaces the fibers, and when it dries, the areas where the watermark is, where the wires are more thinner and more transparent. For watermarks to be read correctly, they have to be observed from left to right. So that is, i.e., the front of the paper, the good side. We're going to come to that later, the good side, because that the whole idea of what the right and wrong side of paper is a very complicated issue. Functionally, watermarks are actually quite mundane. They were mainly produced by paper makers just to say that the paper had been made by a certain place or by a certain person. Papers that were often encountered the Britannia watermark were ones for governments. So you could have papers for particular departments of governments, for particular uses. If you were very wealthy, you could have your own watermark made. I remember seeing once headed note paper for a company which was had a very graceful phoenix watermark. So they could be quite sophisticated and attractive in design, as opposed to being very mundane. Watermarks, in terms of stamps, were for purely security purposes and out of control. So you had, for the penny black issue, a very small watermark, which is a small crown. The idea was that the spacing on which it was printed on the paper, that it would feature where they would just occupy the size of the stamp or be small enough to be on the stamp so that every single one would at least have part of the watermark on it. And that was the same for, say, banknotes and other official documents. And watermarks are generally quite small. When you see them on the dandy roll, they are no more than, say, 5 millimeters across. They are quite small little things. Other watermark papers that were used for stamps, say for the very first issue of India, it's a whole sheet watermark. And so you're able to identify which position you've got if you really want to get to the nitty-gritty of that by finding the position of the watermark and where it is, or with an absence of a watermark, again which position of the sheet it is from. So this particular page here has got an illustration of the dandy roll on the right. We tried many times to get it to come out much brighter than that, but because it's quite a dark thing anyway, it was a bit of a challenge to do so. But you can just see in the middle part the multiple St. Edward's crown, and they are quite closely made together. And this would have been made by hand. Someone would have had to have formed all that together and by own hand. And of course, you can see in the top left there that someone has cut some bits out. So I suspect we may have sold some over the years. On the left, is a piece of imperial crown watermark paper, and this was used on the De La Rue surface printeds, the Lilac and Greens, the Jubilees, Edward the Seventh issues, and the first issues of George V, before the cipher watermarks were introduced. And again, that piece is from the Stanley Gibbons archive as well. And so it goes to show that you could quite clearly see that a stamp would effectively be imprinted onto one of each of those, and of course with this multiple St. Edward's crown, it would have at least 2, 3, maybe even 4, depending on the position of the sheet of paper, per any one stamp. Being able to identify a watermark variety is a bane of my life at times, because I get asked a lot about watermarks, and some are much easier to differentiate than others. And they are of great philatelic interest to philatelists, and in many cases they do actually increase the value of stamp duty to variation watermark. There are some watermark varieties where only say one sheet exists. And this is another watermark bit, and that's the watermark large crown that was used on the penny reds. But how does a watermark variety occur? Well, 9 times out of 10, it's due to human error. In most cases, where the sheet of paper was placed into the press either inverted, either means it's upside down, reversed, that means it's been flipped over to the other side, or inverted and reversed, it's been put in upside down and the wrong way around. Sometimes they're circumstantial, such as where they're printed sideways, or examples of the wrong paper being used for the wrong particular stamp issue, where a part of the watermark has fallen off, so you get missing elements of the watermark. So, for example, for the colonials for Gibraltar, you get on the Georgia 6 issue missing crown CA, where the obviously a bit on the Dandyville just fell off, and they didn't think to repair it, and occasionally they come across. And also with the late Georgia 6 issues and to the early Queen Elizabeth issues, you also get they originally were using the Crown script CA watermark, and then they upgraded it to a St. Edward's Crown type. And of course, when they did repairs to Danny Roll, they just used whatever was to hand. So often you get error St. Edward's Crown within the CA when the rest of the sheet is the script CA watermark. And how can watermark varieties be detected? Well, the general rule is to put them up to a source of light, and you'll be able to find them. Most dealers use a piece of black card, or they can use they can submerge it in a watermark fluid or lighter fluid. Traditionally, that would have been benzene, but unfortunately, that's a carcinogenic, and I wouldn't advise anyone use that. Or you can use electronic watermark detectors. I personally don't get on with electronic watermark machines, except for the Cinescope. That's the only one I've ever found to be particularly useful. And of course, the one that we sell at Stanley Gibbons, that one is good because it does different colors. But on a whole, there are some watermark machines that are out there which are pretty pants. But general rule, light, piece of black card, and sometimes the use of electronic watermarks are very, very useful. In our catalogs, we give full listings and illustrations for all known variations of watermarks. And watermarks can be often misidentified by novices. I don't know how many times I've had it where people have got one watermark confused from another. Another question I get asked an awful lot is how are watermark varieties classified? What constitutes a watermark to become, say, inverted? Well, as we said, often it's just been put in the wrong way. All paper, whether handmade or machine-made paper, has a top or good side, which is the upper side of the sheet, which is impressed upon by the dandy roll, or if it's handmade, has the watermark already embedded in it. The good side is the intended printing surface, and the watermark, when the sheet is held up against the light, is the good side facing, so the good side is facing you, would read from left to right. This is what constitutes as normal. And from the reverse, it would read from right to left. And as we said, watermark varieties occurs due to human error. And if the sheet of paper was put into the press upside down on, say, the bad side, it would result in an inverted watermark, which is the unintended side of the sheet for printing. And of course, you can do it reversed, and upside down, reverted and reversed, causing reversed and inverted and reversed watermarks. Watermarks are often found sideways. This is either due to the fact that this is often because of the way paper was prepared to be printed upon. In the 1870s, on the Sierra Leone issue, I think the Watermark CC issue, the plates were actually smaller than the sheets of paper. So the sheets of paper were designed to print 240 stamps, which I think is double elephant in older imperial size papers. And these would have been supplied to them from the security printers to the Crown agents, and the Crown agents then passed them on to De La Rue. De La Rue didn't make paper, they just took the paper in, and as this was security paper, it was handled in the strictest confidence. You couldn't necessarily hand it out to people because if they had the real paper, you could fake a stamp. So there was a very much big security in the paper right with De La Rue, and the plates that they prepared were only for sheets of 60. So what did the printers do? They didn't just run the overhang paper into the press. No, they cut the paper up. They guillotined it down to fit the plate. And so to fit the plate, they put it on, the paper was placed on, thus resulting in the watermark being sideways. Now, to the printers in De La Rue in the 1870s, it didn't matter. As long as the watermark was on the stamp and it read on the stamp, it was fine. But to philatelists, That's not enough. They have to know why it was done like that. And it was purely because the plate was cut, the plate was smaller than, say, the 240, which was the standard printing plate size. And the other times you often see watermarks inverted is with booklets, because of the way booklets were made, they were the paper, they were sort of in mesh with each other, and so you can get watermarks inverted quite often, and then they were printed on, and then you get them printed upright, but sometimes you also get them sideways from coils. So often it's a case of, say, error or circumstantial that you do get watermark varieties. And watermark varieties are great fun. I know some collectors that will buy all sorts of different types of collections just to go through and check each and every individual stamp for watermark varieties. And often it is the case they do emerge from childhood collections. I once dealt with a gentleman who had bought a childhood collection in a mixed lot of other little stamp albums, and he found a very rare George V watermark on an Indian stamp where it was inverted, where it was inverted and reversed. It was the first one we'd seen in a long time. The catalogue price then was about £3,000. It ended up selling for well over £5,000. Someone really wanted it, and I think the catalogue value now is about £8,500. So it's a watermark variety that is quite rare, and probably only one sheet of, say, 240 ever existed. Another very rare one which comes to mind is Northern Rhodesia, Queen Elizabeth II sixpenny. One whole sheet of that was found inverted, and that is quite highly catalogued. I think about £5,000 that was catalogued at. But some watermark varieties are found that are not necessarily priced at a huge amount. Say ones with booklets, particularly Great Britain, because of the methodology. Some watermark varieties are actually very common. They can be priced at £1 here, 10p, that kind of thing. Some are worth £50, some are worth, say, £400. It all depends the particular type of issues. Watermark varieties and colonials you don't often see, so some of them are generally worth more than you do get on particular British stamps. And really, that does bring us to the end of this talk. It was a very technical talk, and I thank for everyone who has stayed at the course to be able to listen to me rattle on about paper and about the very, very silly world of watermarks, from something that was very, very mundane to something that's become very intrinsic to the very fabric of our hobby. So through this talk, you've seen how technologies underpin the very essence of papermaking, from the traditional handmade process right through to mechanization, from lathe to wove paper to the modern security printed papers, which are often coated in fluorescent inks and phosphors, and then from watermarks from the mundane, just to simply say the papermaker's name or have a decoration upon them, and as a functional intrinsic element of philately, with their states and positions becoming well documented by specialists, with the occasional new discovery as well. And that is something I would like to stress, is that new discoveries can be found on watermark varieties. And so I ask you all to be vigilant, and you never know what you may find when you go through an old album like that. And also, I hope I've helped to advise people on their correct identification, and that can be very much to the benefit of particular stamp's value. And again, I hope you found this informative and at least interesting.
Thanks, Oscar. That was great. I really enjoyed that, especially learning about the paper mills. For me, that's yeah, really interesting because actually both my nan and granddad worked in the Sunderland paper mill. So
Yeah, it was a profession people could do their whole lives, working in a paper mill, and it was quite the job. But people were very proud to work in those kind of mills and those kind of industries.
yeah, yeah, exactly. That's great. And then someone else had asked about consumer grade electronic watermark detectors and whether they're worth the price or sticking to fluid. And I feel like you kind of covered that,
Yeah,
but
well, I can elaborate on it a bit
yeah,
further. Watermark machines work on light, and they sort of press the stamp between a perspex piece of plastic or glass, and then a light is shone through. They can be expensive because they're not necessarily made in huge quantities. It's a quite specific product. They're not necessarily expensive because the elements themselves are a lot of money. It takes a lot of time to make them.
hmm
And so we only may put in an order of, say, 50 when you'd really want to make 2,000 or 5,000 to really bring the price down. I know some philatelists that don't use them at all. I know philatelists that do use them. The only one that I think is particularly very, very good and that we use a lot in Stanley Gibbons is the Cinescope. And I think That was stopped being made in the 2000s, I think. But that one has a much stronger press element, and so you can really look at it that way. So if you're going to invest in any particular one, look out for a cinescope. They're pretty good. But our one as well is not bad as well. We've got one of those as well. But the cinescope is the one I think a lot of dealers do use.
Fab, that's great. Someone then, Paul's made a comment of when watermark detecting in the wild, you can use the backlight of your smartphone. So
Yep, yep. That's I've seen many people in viewing in auctions doing that as well. I nearly always end up blinding myself because I'm really looking at it, but I'm just quite handy using a piece of black card. And I think when you handle them as say much as I do, you do get to recognize the watermarks pretty quickly by just simply looking at stuff. And also sometimes the postmark gives you an indication as well
Mhm.
about what particular watermark it could be.
Yeah,
Um, Particularly on the colonials when they went from watermark multi-crown CA to the script. So often the date is helpful as well, but that's providing it's used.
yeah.
Um,
Great. And Nick has said, hugely interesting talk. Many thanks. Which was the first UK stamp to be printed on pre-gummed paper?
well, the penny black was pre-gummed. Then Perkins Bacon later on got into the position of gumming them themselves, and they would gum them say 2 or 3 times, and that's why you get on the very last line engraved issue the letters in all four corners. It would be very, very thick, crackly gum. Um, so most paper that was already supplied to the printers was already pre-gummed. It was just a bit of the process that they didn't need to do. But by the time you get to sort of the end of the 19th century, most paper was already arriving at the printers already gummed.
Yeah. And then Nick also asked, have you ever made your own paper? And if so, was it tricky?
I have made paper before. I went on a little course down in Somerset. That's where I discovered Two Rivers, and that is the kind of paper that they make. It's very high quality artist grade paper, and this is very thick, and it takes a lot of strength to be able to make a sheet of paper like that. And it's a lot of fun to be able to make it. And of course, the guy who was there called Jim, he's been making paper for 40 odd years, and he can look and say, "Oh, you didn't do that very well. Put it back in." He almost knows immediately if you've got it quite even or evenly distributed across the surface of the mold and the decal. And so it is fun, but it does take a long time to make a sheet of paper. And of course, that they cost infinitely more. And also, if anyone wants to see, this is the watermark bit that I mentioned. I borrowed it from the Stanley Gibbons archive, and it's got the multi St Edward's crown watermark on there. And of course, that would have been wrapped around a cylinder and then pressed upon the sheet of paper as it passed underneath, and with the watermark was impressed on it that way. So that's a bit of a fun thing.
Wow.
And it's a bit of fun, yeah.
Duncan has asked, is chalk paper always chalk rather than kaolin? X-ray fluorescence can be used.
X-ray fluorescence came a bit later. Chalk came first. During the war, you also had a thing called substitute paper, which is where they sort of put any old thing on there. But the differences between substitute paper and chalk surface paper are they can be quite minor. But most papers nowadays are fluorescent coated papers, which is a whitening agent and also makes them quite smooth and rubbery. So if you're getting it like a flyer through the door, it's nearly always printed on. Some people think it's laminated. It's not. It's just the way it's been pressed. All
How
right.
does Stanley Gibbons list the first issue of Canada? The Green Foundation believes it to be machine-based paper. So how do
Well, there are machine-based papers. By the 1850s, machine-based paper was much more prevalent. And of course, in Canada, with the early issues, you do get them on handmade paper as well as machine-made paper. And there is often a difference, particularly on the surface and the overall appearance of the paper and texture.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. That brings us to the end of our talk. Thanks, everybody. Take care, and we will see you at the next talk or roundtable.
We hope to see you at our next Stampex show, at Virtual Stampex or in person in London.